Hello and welcome to Swayam MOOC on British Poetry and Drama 14th to 17th century. I'm Dr. Vanna Rajoria and I'm very happy to be with you all again. In our earlier sessions, we explored the brilliant and defiant mind of Christopher Marlowe, the poet, a mind steeped in classical voices, drawn to myth, danger, and the forbidden. But today, the focus shifts. From Marlowe, the lyrical rebel, we move to Marlowe, the dramatist. At the heart of this transformation stands Dr. Faustus, his most iconic and unsettling creation. Dr. Faustus is more than a play. It is a philosophical gamble. It is tragedy of the soul shaped by the restless spirit of the Renaissance. And it begins not with Faustus but with the ancient voice. Let us begin with the chorus. Long before Elizabethan drama, the chorus actually was the soul of Greek tragedy. It was used to chant, interpret, and pray and also warn people. Then came Thespis, the person who started as a part of chorus but then one day stepped away from chorus and spoke alone with passion and power and great acting. That day he gave birth to dialogue, to character development and also to conflict. Now, this individual voice in chorus endured and so did chorus. Now, chorus evolved in Greek tragedy from Aeschylus to Sophocles to Euripides as the voice of the people, voice of the conscience, of the fate. It basically helped us understand the narratorial perspective. Centuries later, Marlowe, the ever-learned provocateur, revives this voice, not as a relic, but as a resonance. This is not nostalgia. This is Renaissance craftsmanship. So, when Dr. Faustus begins, it begins not with thunder or spectacle, but with a calm, commanding voice, and it is deliberate act of framing. Marlowe is telling us this is not the story of kings or wars, not of armies or empires. It is the story of a man, a scholar, undone not by the world, but by the war within. The function of chorus in a Greek tragedy was very important, but function of chorus in even this tragedy, Dr. Faustus, is very important. Chorus here is not ornamental, it is essential. It opens the play like the overture to a symphony, setting the tone, theme and also the scope. It reminds us that we are not here the spectators alone. We are not here the spectators. We are here to witness a tragedy, intimate, intellectual, internal tragedy. And that brings us now to the play's first words, lines shaped by the memory of antiquity and the anxieties of the Renaissance. But before we turn to those lines, let us pause and reflect on something very important. Let us look at the title of this great tragedy we are going to witness. What is the title of Christopher Marlowe's play? The title, full title is The Tragical History of the Life and Death of Dr. Faustus. When you look at this title, what do you feel? The title is very long. The Tragical History of Life and Death of Dr. Faustus. But here, mind you, Not a single word is accidental. Let's hear it again slowly. The tragical history of the life and death of Dr. Faustus. So, this is not merely a sad story, it is tragical. It belongs to a genre rooted in the deepest structures of the moral thought. You'll remember right from Aristotle to Shakespeare, tragedy is not just about suffering, it is about a profound fall. A fall not brought about by fate alone, but by a fatal flaw of the character, a hubristic choice. So the word tragical in this title signals that, and not only that structure, but entire sentiment, a rise, a transgression, a reckoning. Then comes the second word, history, tragical history. Now, why not call it a tale or a fable? Because in the Renaissance world, history meant much more than chronology. It was a kind of mirror, mirror for princes, a lesson for the citizens, a record of the consequences. So that is, Marlowe doesn't want us to look at this as fiction. He wants us to look at it as moral inquiry. So a history that holds a warning. And what is it that follows? Of the life and death. Marlowe gives us the full arc up front, life and death. So this journey is encircled before it begins. The suspense is not in what happens, but how it unfolds and why it had to. So, then comes Dr. Faustus, our tragic hero. So it is not some king, not some great warrior. It is a doctor, a scholar of theology, a man not of action but of knowledge. This is crucial. In Faustus, we do not get the Greek tragic hero who defies gods with his sword, but we get a Renaissance mind who defies the divine but with his thoughts. And that, students, is what makes this play so disturbing and also so modern. This is the tragedy of intellectual pride, of the spirit that reaches too far, too fast, and pays the price for it. With this, the curtain rises, not onto the man, but onto a voice, not of Faustus himself, but on a chorus, a lone figure who speaks not as a character, but as a commentator, a mediator, a guide. Let us now begin as Marlowe bids us, not with action, but with reflection. Let us begin with the chorus. Behold the opening of chorus of Dr. Faustus. Not marching now in the fields of Thrasymene, where Mars did made the Carthaginians, nor sporting in the dalliance of love, in courts of kings where state is overturned. Take a moment, let that rhyme settle. It's rich, evocative, almost cinematic. Let us look at it slowly, line by line. Not marching now in fields of Thrasymene. This is a classical illusion, Thrasymene. It refers to the great battlefield where Hannibal, the great Carthaginian general, defeated the Romans. By invoking it, Marlowe is recalling the grand epics of war and conquest, the kind of tales written by Homer, Virgil, Dante. But then he says, not marching now. He immediately rejects this battlefield and its grandeur. He says, this isn't a story about armies. It is not a tale of generals, empires, wars fought and won. Then comes the second line, and he says, where Mars did mate the Carthaginians. Mars, it is Roman god of war. To mate here means to defeat or vanquish in battle. So again, what is it that Marlowe is reminding us? This is not the world of classical heroism you are to behold here. You won't find any bloodshed because, he feels there is no glory in it. Marlowe says that we are not going to watch a drama of clashing civilizations. He's closing the door to the entire epical tradition with it, but also reminding us that the grandeur continues. Then he says, nor sporting in the dalliance of love. From battlefield, he takes us to the coldly world of love, pleasure, flirtation. You witness Spenser, Sidney, all come alive. So Marlowe is saying that, nay, this is not the world of war, great epics you'll witness. But he also says, this is not the world of love, romantic comedy either. You would not find Ovidian charm or Elizabethan courtly drama. And then he says, but again, nor sporting. So this isn't a romantic play. There will be no lovers' tricks, no happy marriages. What is the fourth line? In courts of kings where state is overturned. So Marlowe, is not slow in reminding the whole world of political tragedy to us, and when you think of it, you think of Shakespeare's Richard II or maybe Macbeth, where the fall of kings, it leads to collapse of nations. But what Marlowe is saying here is that, we are not going to do that either. So everything which Renaissance audience expects from the theatre, Marlowe in the very beginning announces, no, this is not what we are going to witness here. Neither great, epical heroes, not great generals, not even courtly love, wars. Then you wonder what kind of play it is. When it is not about war, it is not about love or even politics. So Marlowe here is doing two things at once. While he is invoking the entire classical tradition, wars, gods, kings, love, he is also shutting it all down immediately. He's telling us this is not a play about the outer world. It is about the inner world. It is about a man, not a myth, about a soul, not a state. Then the lines continue. And what is it that he says in the lines which follow, line number 5 to 8? So basically he moves from promise to doom. And he says, but to patient judgments we appeal, to censure of our stage. This scanty plot of ground shall be the stage where Faustus mounts to fall and chase the gloomy path from joy to woe. The chorus has moved past tales of war and courtly drama, and now it turns inward, telling us this isn't about kings or knights. It's about the conflict within the soul, not the outside world. And then remember, patient judgments. So chorus addresses you directly, but not as passive viewers, but as thoughtful judges, reminding us our role here isn't to watch, but to weigh, to reflect, to measure, to discern. We are asked to be more than just an audience. We are to be the conscience of the play. The words, we appeal. Appeal is a legal term. So a plea here. So what is it that Marlowe through chorus appeals to us? That, in this Faustus's story, we need to listen very carefully from the very beginning to understand not what just happens, but also why it happens, because later we have to pass the judgment. Then follow the next lines where the chorus says, mounts to fall, gloomy path from joy to woe. Now, this is tragedy in miniature. You witness Faustus's climb only to see his fall. His rise is already shadowed by his ruin. The whole journey from joy to sorrow, from promise to doom. The next lines 9 to 12, they increase the tension further. We'll show you Faustus's fortunes, good or bad, and now the man is born. His parents, base of stock, in Germany, within a town called Rhodes, at riper years to Wittenberg he went. Behold the promise of the chorus to show us all, not merely triumphs, but trials, not only stars, but the storm. Faustus is not born into nobility, nor cast in the glow of divine favor. His parents, they're ordinary people, base folk, humble, obscure. Yet from this lowly soil rises a mind that dares to touch the heavens. He's born in Germany, a land, remember, shaken by reform, aflame with questions that unsettle the old order, the great chain of being. And then he moves to Wittenberg. He journeys to the cradle of Protestant Reformation, the very epicenter of theological revolution. So, what Faustus is doing here is not merely seeking knowledge. He is basically hungry for knowledge. It is insatiable thirst for knowledge which you'll witness in a world which is turning away from the medieval towards the modern. It is kind of step forward. So, you see Faustus established in these lines as a challenger. Then come the next lines. They remind us of the, whole garden of learning, seed of pride. Listen to them. So soon he profits in divinity, the fruitful plot of scholarism grazed, that shortly he was graced with doctor's name, excelling all whose sweet delight disputes. Mind of Dr. Faustus blossoms like a tree in spring. He studies theology, not dutifully, but brilliantly, quickly, eagerly, passionately. A very competent learner. He is a dazzling scholar. Marlowe links his learning to a fruitful plot, garden of intellect, And Faustus basically is its finest flower, finest bloom. He is graced with doctor's name. The phrase is rich with irony, for the grace he receives is divine, and yet it is this very grace which will later lead to his fall. He excels not only in knowledge but in disputations also, the art of argument, debating, the joy of verbal combat. Faustus delights in turning sacred truths over and over like jewels in the light. But what begins as a passion begins his peril, his downfall. These lines are important because they make us see his mind in full glory and also wait upon his ruin. Dr. Faustus worships knowledge but forgets wisdom. He debates the divine but begins also to doubt it. Already we sense the tragic seed that the pursuit of truth, if not tempered by humility, may lead to destruction, settling one of the thematic concerns of the play. Next lines, are even more prominent. Listen to the Icarus moment, hubris. In heavenly matters of theology, till swollen with cunning of a self-conceit, his waxen wings did mount above his reach, and melting heavens conspired his overthrow. This is the tragic pivot. Faustus has flown too high, not on faith, but on intellect, sharpened by his pride, headlong pride, and therefore he witnesses the great fall. So he is swollen with cunning. He is inflated by brilliance, drunk on his own mind, and therefore Marlowe invokes this myth of Icarus, the boy who dared to fly on waxen wings, wings of wax. Now, Faustus becomes the Renaissance Icarus, rising not with feathers, but with knowledge bound too tight to itself. So, as Icarus did, so will Faustus. He will fall from gaze. But heavens melt his wings. So, his fall here is not just physical. It is also metaphysical. It is divine judgment. Now, remember this term, hubris. It's important and crucial to understanding tragedy of Faustus. Hubris basically is the headlong pride, excessive pride, pride which leads to fatal flaw, leads to the soul, of tragedy. So, when, we forget wisdom, it leads to fall. So, here Dr. Faustus forgets what the ancients always knew, that the gods punish those who climb too far, too fast, and are too proud. Listen to the lines which follow. For falling to a devilish exercise and glutted now with learning's golden gifts, he surfeits upon cursed necromancy. Nothing so sweet as magic is to him. When you listen to these lines, you already start sensing how wrong this great scholar Faustus has gone. So Faustus has turned from light of theology, from the road of God, to the dark roads of necromancy. It is a giant leap, which will, make him fall. It is a devilish exercise. Faustus is choosing, sorcery over God. It's like choosing sword over pen. And it's not random, it's not casual. He's glutted. He's stuffed with knowledge. He's fed on learning. He will not stop until he is satisfied. So the golden gift of intellect, it now hungers for more and more, mystery, mastery, power, he surfeits necromancy, not only tastes it but binges upon it. And in his mouth, magic starts seeming sweeter and sweeter, sweeter than truth, sweeter than nobility, sweeter than grace. This is moment of seduction. We understand as audience that Faustus is not tempted by evil that looks ugly. He's tempted by evil that is so beautiful, glittering, golden. He's tempted by magic, And the moment you look at this word, you're reminded of the fruit of forbidden tree, Like Faustus, like Eve was seduced, Faustus is seduced by his irresistible urge, hunger for knowledge. The next lines, you already approach with an understanding of the coming storm. And the chorus tells us, which he prefers before his chiefest bliss, and this the man that in his study sits. Dr. Faustus prefers magic over everything. He considers it its his chiefest place. it is more important to Dr. Faustus than salvation itself. Faustus chooses power over peace, shadows over light, and basically all this leaves us not in action but in stillness. So there is no thunder, no devils, only a man sitting in his study, thinking, choosing, falling. This moment is quiet, but within it brews a storm. The great tragedy does not begin with a pact or a demon. It begins with desire, swelling in the silence of the soul. This is great. This is important because all of us relate to it. It is not true battlefield. It is not in heaven or hell. It is in the heart. Faustus, alone with his thoughts, already halfway to damnation. The tragedy has begun, and we as readers understand because we see so much of our own thirst, for more in it, which, may seem noble, but, at times leads to disaster. These opening lines from the prologue, they are not merely opening lines. They are also, kind of prophecy. Chorus in Dr. Faustus is nowhere like the, relic of Greek tragedy. In this play, it becomes the conscience, the whole moral compass of the play. Chorus asks us to watch the play for judging it. It requests us to feel with responsibility. So while in ancient drama, Chorus sang of empires, gods, kings, Marlowe narrows the stage from the battlefield to the study, from the fate of nations to the fate of one man, a scholar, not a soldier, a thinker, not a prince. So from epic, he takes us to the intimate, and this shift in tragedy, Greek tragedy, this shift in tragedy is important. While Greek tragedy gave us heroes destroyed by fate, Marlowe gives us a man undone by his own mind. Faustus is not born great, he chooses his path. His battle is not outward, it is inward battle against desire, against doubt, against pride. So Faustus basically, you can understand, is our first modern tragic hero, a man ruined not by others but by himself. And this is what makes Marlowe so ahead of his time, so universal and so important. Chorus in Faustus basically, makes us stand as mirror and witnesses. It invites us to pass judgment, on Chaucer's brilliance, but not excuse his blindness. Dr. Faustus seeks everything, finds everything, yet loses one thing. He trades eternity for appetite for knowledge, and Chorus reminds us to be on guards ever since the very beginning. As readers, you should understand this, that Faustus's tragedy is intellectual tragedy. Faustus is not driven by violence but by yearning for knowledge, thirst for knowledge, desire for power, for transcendence. And it is this that leads to his downfall. Not what he lacks, but what he refuses to accept. And it still matters today. When we read Dr. Faustus, we do not see just a man. We see a mirror unto ourselves. We understand what happens when knowledge outturns wisdom, when ambition forgets humility. These questions haunt every age, every man, including ours, including us. So, as we close our discussions of the chorus of Dr. Faustus's tragedy, remember this: Dr. Faustus is not simply a play, it is a moral inquiry wrapped in great verse. The true stage moral builds is not outside but within us, and the chorus, gentle but grave, leaves us with this awareness. In the life of one man, we must examine all lives, including our own. Let us now quickly recapitulate what we have learnt today, what we have understood about the shift in Faustus's chorus from the classical trend to the Marlowe's experiment. Let us gather back and let us try and understand. We began today's session by talking about what is chorus. We understood how it stands as a gateway of the tragedy, how it enhances our understanding of tragedy. We traced the origins of chorus from the hills of ancient Greece, where choruses sang of heroes and gods and its transformation. Then, we looked at it in Renaissance drama, where, it evolved. So, it no longer narrated epical tales, but, the struggles of the soul. In Dr. Faustus, the chorus basically, we saw how it becomes the voice of conscience. So, it doesn't tell us what to think, it asks us to think. Then, together, we walked line by line through the play. We saw how the chorus invited us as patient judges to judge Faustus's journey. It gave us an awareness of how a humble man of extraordinary intellect rose swiftly in divine learning, and how his hunger for more and more and more led him to turn from theology to magic, from God to devil. We watched as the Icarus image took flight. Faustus's wings of knowledge melted in the heat of his pride. We also saw how learning, once a grace, became an addiction, a bane to him. And finally, we left him sitting alone in silence, his mind the true battlefield. With this, we come to an end of today's discussions. From the voice of the chorus, now we'll move to the voice of the man himself. We'll step into the Faustus's study. We'll listen to his first soliloquy, where he dissects logic, medicine, law, theology, and finally turns toward magic. And in that moment, the real tragedy begins. So, until then, reflect on this. Is it better to be content in limits, or to risk everything for the taste of true boundless power? And if you could know the secrets of the universe, what would you want to? Thank you. I'll see you in the next session.